Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the United States Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Beyond the Ballot, International Implications of the U.S. Election. We are grateful to our moderator, Kate Durian, from the World Energy Council for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.usae.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Kate Dourian, Regional Manager for the Middle East and Gulf States at the World Energy Council. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good day, everybody. We have, I think you can see the profiles of our speakers, but we're very honored to have with us today to discuss the international implications of the US election and energy as a foreign policy tool. So with me is Ed Morse, who's Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy at Citi Research. Amos Hochstein, who's former US Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs and who's been described as Obama's energy diplomat. And Dana Stroul, who is the Shelley and Michael Kasson Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So we're not going to have opening statements. We're just going to sort of go straight into our discussion. And I wanted to point out that we've seen major disruption to the global energy markets. We've seen demand drop by, more than we've seen in our lifetimes. We've seen US oil prices go sub-zero. We've seen a move, a possible accelerated energy transition. And in February this year, just before the pandemic, US Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette was quoted as saying that the US transformation into a net exporter of energy had revolutionized our foreign policy and frees us to pursue options that we have not had, at least in my lifetime. Now, in view of what's happened since, this was back in February, so it was the start of the pandemic, have we seen a blunting of this instrument, and how will the US election change the energy policy and with it the sort of foreign policy of the United States vis-a-vis sanctions as an energy, as a policy tool, foreign policy tool, the relationship with the trade relationship with China, the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, there's a lot we can talk about, the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is an important ally and very close to the Trump administration. And we know that we cannot predict what the election result is going to be, but we do know that the energy policies of the 2 candidates is very, very different. So I'm going to start, Ed, with you, and tell us about whether you see the current situation with US production having declined because of this demand slump, and with predictions that it will probably go into decline sometime over the next decade. Is the US still in a position to play that international role as one of the top oil producers in the world and a gas exporter as well?
Well, yes, and the role is kind of changed. We don't know, by the way, when US production will peak. We have to remember that parts of the Permian Basin are very much like the Guar field. We are looking at technology that's extending the amount of the known resource base that can be exploited. So I would say not in anybody's lifetime around this room are we going to see a decline that's permanent in US production. I think we're seeing in 2 different ways what the US has done to the international environment. Certainly the facts of how low prices need to be to get US exploitation growing has crimped the market share conditions for other major players. And what we've seen so far this year are contributions to rebalancing, some intentional by producers, some non-intentional by other producers. So the US and Canadian production levels have declined significantly. Canada is down close to 700,000 barrels a day. The US, depending on whose data you want to look at and what date you're looking at a peak, the weekly peak around 13 million barrels a day, the monthly peak 12.3 million barrels a day on the EIA data. We're under 11 for sure, probably heading for under 10. The drilling activity is benign to say the least. We're at least 220 rigs away from keeping production from falling, but it's creeping up. It's price determined. But the US is making a contribution to the rebalancing of the market on the oil side. And you can be sure that Saudi Arabia and Russia are looking at US production very carefully to see what they can do to regain market share, knowing that has been the major impediment. Now, this is not directed policy, it's the way the markets work. On the gas side, this will be really the first winter that we have US gas production, US LNG production at a level similar to that of the Qataris. A year ago, it was around 46, 47 million tons. And this year it's over 70 million tons. The US is the swing. And where global gas prices go is very much a function of where US gas prices are. And the US is the swing producer. It's the marginal producer on the LNG side. Whether European gas is going to be $2 per million BTUs or 4.5 or 5 is very much a function of global demand conditions and the US production base. So the US is there. It's not there as a mischief-making, directed from the top producer. It's there because it has a very important impact on the markets that's not going to go away anytime soon. And the markets are all liquid markets, including natural gas liquids, where the role is pretty spectacularly important given the fact that the US is the largest NGL exporter in the world, and it either makes or doesn't make room for Saudi exports to China. The US is a million barrel a day, close to it, exporter of oil to China, and that makes a difference for other countries of the world. And the swing of $4 or $5 per million BTUs that we could see in winter and spring gas is very much a function of what the shale revolution has brought.
And Amos, do we see this continuing in the event of a Biden win? Do we see this sort of continued focus on oil production? I mean, we've seen a lot of talk about banning fracking on federal land from the Biden camp. We're seeing tensions with Europe over methane emissions of LNG. I think there's one project, the NG project with the US is on hold at the moment. We've seen a sort of move toward more decarbonized, the sort of the carbon neutral pledges by the likes of by the EU and China and now Japan. Is that going to have an impact on the ability of the US to sort of use energy as a foreign policy tool?
Well, I'm not quite sure that I can explain or respond to Secretary Briette's comment about revolutionizing American foreign policy as a result of hydrocarbon exports from the United States. I'm not quite sure that I know the answer to that question. But look, I think everything that Ed said, of course, describes where we are today and what the short-term outlook is moving forward. And I don't think that changes in the short term between a President Trump or a President Biden. The question becomes, what is the direction that a potential President Biden would take in leading U.S. energy policy domestically, and how that impacts globally. And I think you take that in two pieces. And of course, I don't speak for the Biden campaign, but just in listening to what they've been saying publicly. The idea is, as Vice President Biden said, he's not banning fracking. He's not looking at eliminating the fossil fuel industry in the short term, but rather looking at accelerating the transition away from fossil fuels towards alternatives and towards more efficiency. And what that means is that in the short term, we're going to continue to see the growth that we have seen, and that the US growth or decline in production is going to be market-based and price-based, and not necessarily policy-based. However, a number of things, if Biden gets elected, are going to happen. One, the regulatory environment is going to change, and the most obvious and likely scenario is the first thing that will happen is bringing back some of the rolled back regulations from the Obama administration that were eliminated by the Trump administration over the first couple of years. The second is more of an important shift overall to accelerate this transition of how do you ensure that that the public, the consumer, and companies are incentivized to move from fossil fuels towards renewables. And there's been, when non-energy people talk about energy policy, you end up in a political debate about a move from oil to renewables, when of course you have to separate these things out. Are we talking about the power? Are we talking, what are we really referring to? If electric vehicles are able to grow in a more accelerated fashion than we've seen before, because the Biden administration is going to put subsidies behind the purchase of those cars, increase the number of charging stations, et cetera, using the federal government to accelerate that could have a medium-term impact on oil demand globally. But I think that we have to look at the Biden administration as bringing back regulation, putting a price on methane, and trying to reduce flaring, which will bring somewhat higher costs to a barrel produced in the United States. And working not just domestically, but internationally together with allies to see how we get to a Paris 2.0. How do we, the same goals that you talked about before, of a net zero emissions by certain dates. Vice President Biden has already committed to those dates as well, as you mentioned, China and Europe have. And now, what kind of agreements are we able to reach with the international community that put more pressure on exports from the United States? Because again, they will raise the price on commodities out of the United States. So I think it will be ultimately market driven, but the question is, does the government play a role in determining what some of the costs are associated? Lastly, I would say that for the US, as Ed pointed out, we have seen dramatic growth in the LNG industry, but the question becomes for both gas and oil, what does the picture look like moving forward to grow? And there, I think that the ability to get permits through the federal government system are going to be, I imagine it would be significantly more difficult, more expensive, would take longer, and more, not just from a timeline, but questionable whether or not we'll be able to reach and to receive those kinds of permits for pipelines and infrastructure in both oil and gas. So it's not necessarily about rolling back things that exist, but rather how much growth when there's need for new infrastructure, how easy and how cheap will that be to achieve moving forward under a Biden administration.
Thanks, Amos. Dana, I'm going to come to you because one of the fact that the US rose to be the biggest oil producer in the world at one point, overtaking Russia and Saudi Arabia, allowed the market to be supplied enough that sanctions could be tightened against Iran. And we've seen even recently, I mean, the tightening of the screws against Iran. We've seen sanctions against Venezuela and some sanctions against Russia, including the Nord Stream gas pipeline project, which is quite contentious in Europe. How do you see the sanctions issue progressing under a Biden administration? Would he restore the nuclear agreement with Iran? And if he does win, and if that does occur, what would happen to the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, which has been one of the proponents of tighter restrictions on Iran its ability to exert more influence within the Gulf region. So is that an accurate statement?
Thanks so much for all of those questions, and good morning or good afternoon to people tuning into this session. So let me just take a step back first and paint a little bit of a picture of U.S. policy attitudes towards the Middle East. There are some, if you take out the adjectives and the noise and just listen more to the content of what elected officials are saying, among many on our left and our right in our political discourse. And if you listen to many of the statements that Barack Obama said at the end of his administration and compare it to what Donald Trump said, there are some striking parallels, which is generally that the United States has overinvested in the Middle East, particularly as the security provider or guarantor for the free flow of energy, stability in insurance markets, et cetera. And now that the United States is a net energy exporter, we don't need to fill that role anymore for others to just piggyback off of the enormous investments that we've made, such as China, who has no interest in being the security provider for Gulf countries, but certainly benefits from the massive investment, tens of thousands of US forces stationed across bases all over Gulf countries and others in the region. So there's some similarities on the right and the left about the overinvestment militarily, the desire to no longer be militarily engaged in the Middle East, and that because of that and because of our energy profile and the fact that we are a net energy exporter now, we can take a step back from some of those roles in the Middle East. Just like Amos, I don't speak for the Biden administration or the Biden campaign, but I'm certainly listening very closely to what they're saying. And they are also talking about concerns about overinvestment in the military instruments of the US national security toolbox and switching back into a much more supercharged diplomacy, development, other US tools to influence behavior, decision-making, and events in the Middle East. So that's number one. Just at a strategic level, there is a striking similarity among many across the Washington policy circle that because of the energy profile, the United States can take a step back from its involvement in the Middle East. The second issue, Kate, that you asked me to talk about was the Iran nuclear agreement. So from where I sit, the Biden campaign could not be more clear about this. They have said they will go back into compliance with the agreements with US commitments in the Iran nuclear deal. Now, I think it's fine to say as an aspiration for a possible Biden administration, whether or not the regime in Tehran would be interested in walking back the ways in which they have not complied with their commitments under the nuclear framework in order to get whatever sanctions relief could be provided under the JCPOA, I think is an open question. As to whether or not the other stakeholders in the JCPOA, the European three, France, Germany, and the UK, as well as Russia and China would be interested in immediately coming back into compliance with the JCPOA, or whether there are advantages to staying in this gray space of non-compliance. The regime in Iran and Iranian citizens also learned that even with the sanctions relief provided under the Iran nuclear agreement, there was not an immediate turnaround in the Iranian economy. Welfare, social welfare, economic welfare did not magically improve. A lot of that is because of endemic corruption and systemic problems within Iran's own economy. And so I think there's also a lesson learned as you look at the Iranian political landscape. They have presidential elections coming up, whether or not it is in the interest of Iran's leaders to come back into compliance with an agreement. Not to mention that those that might, because of sanctions relief that the United States could provide if it comes back into compliance with the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, whether or not banks and the private sector, given the head-turning ways in which US policy has used sanctions, particularly in the Trump administration, whether or not the private sector would just follow based on re-entering the Iran nuclear agreement as a political agreement. So here, I think the Iranians have also learned a lesson by the entry of the Obama administration into the Iran nuclear deal, and then the Trump administration's unilateral withdrawal, that political agreements made by the executive branch without the full support and buy-in of the US Congress or some sort of affirmative congressional action about sanctions relief, that perhaps these kinds of agreements are not that stable over the medium term. And so I think there will be some questioning in Iran as to whether it's actually in their interest to come back into compliance early in a possible Biden administration. Then I'll just briefly touch on the US-Saudi relationship. There's been a rising chorus in Congress that is bipartisan. This is not exclusively a criticism of Democratic foreign policy makers, that the nature of the US-Saudi relationship needs to change, that it is not actually strategic perhaps, that it should be more transactional. What does that look like? And you've seen several places where members on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, have come together to take votes that even though President Trump has vetoed some of those things, such as stopping weapon sales, removing US forces from involvement in the Saudi-led coalition's war in Yemen, et cetera. The fact that there is a bipartisan foundation for these things suggests that the tide is moving in one direction, and it's not an uphill battle for the Biden administration, if there is one, to say now is the time to reassess the US-Saudi relationship. And there's been a whole litany of actions over the last several years that I think provide a fact pattern for those who want to question the US-Saudi relationship. And there's for those that are looking for a reason to question it, you could put together a fact pattern that says the actions of the Saudi government in the region are destabilizing. And so this isn't a strategic partnership because we have not been consulted, and there are several things happening both domestically inside Saudi Arabia and regionally. And now with the before President Trump's engagement and mediation with Russia and Saudi Arabia about the OPEC Plus agreement, the fact of those decisions impacting US energy markets, US financial interests is serious. There's a huge amount of attention on human rights problems inside Saudi Arabia. There is tremendous concern about the ongoing rift between Qatar and the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and the implications of that for all sorts of regional conflicts. There is tremendous amounts of concern about the ongoing conflict in Yemen, continuing bombings that are implicating civilians in Yemen, et cetera. So there are a series of areas in which I think there will be tension between a Biden administration and officials in the Saudi government. Now, whether or not that means abandonment or direct conflict, or that there are just a series of issues that need to be worked out, I think certainly there are people in Riyadh that are very concerned that there will not be the perceived blank check that a President Trump has given the Saudi government. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so you did mention that Iran is also due to have elections coming up. And I mean, the fact that oil production has collapsed, they're hardly exporting anything at all. If the nuclear deal is revived under maybe longer period of time, tighter, I think this is what the Democratic candidate has said he would like to see, that would, the possibility of a hardliner coming into power, and I think we're seeing changes in Iran that would indicate that is a possibility. Now, we have seen one of the criticisms of the JCPOA was that it actually gave Iran the funds that would allow it to intervene in Yemen and Syria and other conflicts in the region. So if that were to happen, we saw attacks on tankers. In last year, we saw the attack on the Saudi Abqaiq the facility, oil gathering facility. And I mean, that was pretty huge, and there was no response. So you've also talked about the US sort of disengaging a little bit from the region. But if that were to happen, I mean, surely, despite the fact that the US doesn't really need to import that much oil from the Middle East anymore, there is a new dynamic. We've seen a peace agreement between UAE and Israel. We've seen Sudan now, the latest. We've seen Bahrain. There is a sort of potential for things to get a bit out of hand if we see these changes. So what would the US still sort of step back, under whichever administration, would it still sort of be a neutral observer? They do have a huge base in Qatar. We're seeing more involvement from Turkey, a NATO member. We're seeing a lot of activity in the East Med. I mean, there's a lot of potential flashpoints. Ed, do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, I'd say, we've got to look at how complicated US relationships are across the Middle East. I would describe a Biden administration as moving toward a normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia, rather than taking a position that there's going to be a complete change in US policy toward the kingdom. The relationship has been thick. It is thickened by a number of things that are of interest to a Green Biden administration. I'd just like to point out that on issues related to the energy transition, Saudi Arabia plays a significant role. It's playing a significant role, a spectacular role, you might say, in moving toward a hydrogen economy. As chair of the G20, it's also been pushing for carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization. We've had Saudi chairing meetings all year on how to finance carbon capture and sequestration. It is a critical partner from an energy perspective on an energy transition, just to name one area where the world is really a little bit more complicated than simply one based on human rights or spending in the neighborhood. And certainly of all of the concerns about who is spending what in the neighborhood, there are concerns about Iranian spending, there are concerns about Russian spending, there are concerns about Chinese spending, and all of these, make it very difficult for the US to extract itself from its Middle East role, as Amos knows, having been in the Obama administration that was trying to turn from the Middle East toward the Asia Pacific region, and found it very difficult strategically to do so.
Thanks. Amos, do you want to step in here?
Well, a lot's been said so far. Look, I think there's always been this false premise, by the way, not just in the United States, but also in the Gulf itself, that the relationship between the United States and the Gulf is as simple as it always was. We provide you hydrocarbons and you provide us security, or some kind of form of covenant like that. And this is not something that was just being written about. These were the leadership in the Gulf was, when I was in my old job talking to some of the rulers and leaders in the Gulf, they would talk about the concern about the increase of US production, that this means the United States wasn't committed to the region. And I think fundamentally it's somewhere in between what Ed just said and what Dana was talking about. We were not only there because of oil and gas, and therefore we're not just going to leave because we don't need it. When we, as Ed just said, when we try to extricate ourselves from the Middle East tends to chase us home, or at least part of the way home into Europe. So a stable Middle East is something that has been a US foreign policy interest always, and will continue to be. We have strong interest in the region. These are not necessarily strategic alliances that are based on values, on shared values. We don't have a lot of shared values with some of the countries in the region. We have some quite significant conflicts from a value base, from a value perspective. However, we also have strategic interests that we need to protect and ensure, and we work with folks. Now, I think that the relationship that a Biden administration would face is quite complicated. There's clearly going to be a continued strong relationship with UAE, despite the fact that there are significant differences, specifically with regard to Iran and Iran policy. And I think those are stated rather publicly and emphatically by both Vice President Biden and his senior team, as well as by the Emiratis. There is a strong interest that to return to the JCPOA, whether it is immediately returning, as Dana said, and Kate, you talked about the elections in Iran. We're going to have to see what those elections are. But remember, those elections are going to be after the Iranians already know what happened in the elections in the United States. And therefore, while I wouldn't want to suggest that the democratic process in Iran will be affected by its leadership, I would actually say exactly that. They will determine the outcome of that election based on what their interests are, if they would like to get back into the JCPOA or not. The United States may go back right in. It may also decide to do a JCPOA minus, where we have a freeze of sanctions and nuclear activities in Iran, while we figure out how to perhaps extend the dates of the sunset provisions or several other things that can be worked on before you re-enter a permanent deal. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, I think that this is a different Saudi Arabia than the Obama administration left behind. Things have happened in the last 4 years, and the Biden administration is going to have a difficult and complicated task of recreating a relationship with Saudi Arabia, and I'm not quite sure what exactly it's going to look like. I do know it's not going to look like it is today between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia. And I think Dana points out a very important point, and that is there is a notion that there's Democrats' view of the relationship with Saudi Arabia and Republican view, and that is inaccurate. It is masked by the fact that Republicans in Congress do not want to take too strong a position against the stated position of the Trump administration. But if there is no Trump administration, the views of the Republicans in Congress are not very different than those of Democrats in Congress. Perhaps they come from different perspectives and they're sourced from they're anchored in different things, but they are quite difficult. So I think the task of the Biden administration will be to build a relationship that is new. It will not look like the relationship of old, but it will also not look like it does today. And that's going to be something that both sides are going to have to figure out what they want to do. I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's going to be complicated. I do think there are a lot of positives in the relationship between the Gulf and the United States, because I think the Trump administration built on the years of warming of relations between Israel and the Gulf, and that led to the Abraham Accords. I think those can be probably can be extended further, regardless of who is the president of the United States. But I think the hydrocarbon question is not going to shape the relationship. We are not going to have the nature of the relationship in the Gulf is not going to be based on how much oil we need from the Middle East. That's definitely not going to be the case. So then I think the question becomes, what are the things that we can achieve in the energy space? And I think Ed is right. There's too little attention or too simplistic a view in the United States by many about the energy relationship with the Gulf, that it's all about oil. These are the largest oil producers, and some of them have taken some of the biggest steps when it comes to their own dependency and their own use of fossil fuels in their own economies and country, whether it's in UAE with nuclear and as the host of the IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and the big investments that some of these countries are making into a renewable economy. And I think part of that is understanding that the one thing that they've talked about for 30 years and did not really succeed in doing is the diversification, the Vision 2030 in Saudi and other diversification plans in other countries away from fossil fuels didn't really ever bear any fruit. And that's why I think that what they're looking at now, which makes more sense to me, is not diversifying away from energy, but perhaps diversifying away from oil and gas. And they know energy, and therefore and they have resources. So investing in what would be the green tech and renewable energy and becoming leaders in that industry could be something that works for them, works for the United States, supports the goal of the Biden administration in trying to make this a more global push towards climate, and not just a US, Europe with some China, but rather a truly global effort on climate change, and the Middle East can play a role in that. So I think the relationship is going to be patchy and good with some, complicated with others. And I think the Iran deal ultimately will be a story of the first year, and countries in the region are going to have to get over it. We're going to have to agree to disagree on that one, as we did in the Obama administration, and continue to fashion the relationship around other issues.
Thanks, Amos. Yes, I think Dana, you want to come in at this point.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to make sure that what I said up front is understood correctly. There is a view that the United States has overly invested militarily. So when you listen to Biden campaign officials talk about their vision for the US role in the Middle East, they are clearly talking about rebuilding the civilian national security core of our US government, making sure that our embassies, not in Gulf countries, but in assistance receiving Middle East countries, that how our assistance, how our diplomacy, whether it's energy diplomacy, conflict resolution and mediation, political and economic reform engagement, that takes priority, not the military tool. And I do think that there is, certainly if you look at members of Congress who have criticized either Trump administration for perceived weaknesses in certain areas, or during the Obama administration, members of Congress are very eager to introduce bills and legislate by mandating imposition of sanctions, US-led sanctions. There's clearly a recognition among the Biden team that the United States at this point finds itself rather isolated and pulling along both countries in the private sector and following US-led sanctions policy. I think if there's a Biden administration, there will be a few themes that will govern engagement in the Middle East. One is burden sharing. So you've seen the Trump administration talk a little bit about, we're not going to do this ourselves. We're not going to be, everyone else has to contribute. That started in the Obama administration. The US global coalition to defeat ISIS when it took over Iraq and Syria. The basic framework of the Iran nuclear agreement, which was a multilateral framework to engage, not just the United States. What Ebola response, these were multilateral efforts sharing the burden, not just US on its own, but US-led coalitions. I think you're going to see the Biden administration attempt to continue that framework in the Middle East, and it's going to expect burden sharing on all sorts of issues from the Gulf countries. And two is certainly a perception that US values, whether it's human rights, political reform, economic reform, have been not just under prioritized, but nowhere in the talking points of the Trump administration. And countries, governments, and officials in the Gulf and in the Middle East do not like to have conversations with the United States about human rights. That is going to happen if there's a Biden administration. There are US citizens in detention across the Middle East. There are large areas where citizens of these countries are detained. There has been the use of the COVID pandemic to further tighten the screws of political repression. And those issues will be raised by the Biden administration, and it will be uncomfortable, and it will introduce tension into some of these relationships. I also think that a US government can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can have uncomfortable relationships when there's a view that actions taken by governments are inherently destabilizing, and the United States has an interest in stable partners, and at the same time continue to have productive conversations on things like alternative energy and energy relations. That's what I think about the Biden administration, a potential Biden administration. Now, on UAE-Israel normalization and this wave of normalization, I'm going to paraphrase and not quote directly, but the leader of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, said that he wants to celebrate on the day that his government is no longer, the Emirati economy is no longer dependent on hydrocarbons. He looks at the global picture, at trends in energy, and he knows that one day the oil will not be there, that his economy needs to diversify, that he needs to prepare his population to compete globally, whether it's alternative energy and just general economic diversification. Whether or not the Trump administration recognizes that, I don't know. But But his view is that there is so much to be gained from economic interaction with Israel. Israel is a leader in alternative energy, in renewables, in green tech, bio, etc. And this is a leader who has decided, even if the United States was there to mediate and assist at the beginning, this is something that probably would have happened because Abu Dhabi believes it's in their interest to normalize relations with Israel, that there's so much to be gained in the economic space, in the energy space, in the people-to-people ties, etc. This is stabilizing for the Middle East. I also think that what they are able to build on now started from a basic concern about the Iran nuclear agreement. The Emiratis were vocally opposed to it, as were the Israelis. And this is going to be an area where perhaps governments of the region may not be supportive of a Biden administration policy to re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement. Now, Amos said, well, they're just going to have to live with it. I think that there's a possibility that introduces some significant tension in relationships between the United States and governments in the Middle East early on in a Biden administration. It is something that will need to be worked through, but we should anticipate that if that is the chosen policy, I think there will be tension.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I mean, one of the things that we've seen is this transition away from hydrocarbons. Ed, you mentioned carbon capture and storage, hydrogen. We saw recently Saudi Arabia exporting the first green ammonia shipment to Japan. I mean, this is still early days. It's all about costs, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, you have to bring down the costs that somebody has to pay. But to go back to the Iran nuclear agreement, I agree that there is a transition away from hydrocarbons, but at the end of the day, even Vision 2030, yes, was supposed to encourage private sector investment, was supposed to encourage non-oil investments, but it hasn't really progressed because you do need oil at a certain price in order to carry out these reforms. As somebody said, it was like taking from one wallet and putting it into another. We've seen the privatization of Aramco and Amos, I saw you in Saudi back in February. There is, when I visited Aramco, they are investing a lot in research and development. They are looking at hydrogen for transport. They're looking at, in fact, they are going to, I think, have the biggest hydrogen plant in green hydrogen in NEOM, which sort of is a bit strange. But when you look at the and Dana, you mentioned technology and how that's playing a big role, and that might be one of the pluses of the UAE-Israel agreement to normalize relations. But is that going to be the new sort of source of tensions with, say, China? Because obviously they are leaders in solar energy. The IEA says solar is king. Is that something that we're going to see new tensions arise with China, apart from this, the trade dispute? Somebody mentioned the other day at another webinar that Zoom is now more valuable than Exxon. So we're seeing this shift because technology is going to play a bigger role in this energy transition. Is that going to be a new source of tension with China? Ed, maybe you can go there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a new source of tension. It's an existing tension, and it's an existing reality. If you look at Israel as the Silicon Valley of the Middle East, one of the sources of tension between the US and Israel is exactly Chinese investment in the Israeli tech center. And there are very good reasons to be concerned about that. What role China will play in technological developments in the Middle East, whether it's going to be one of an investor adding to the intellectual capital of the region, or whether it's going to be somebody taking away intellectual capital from the region, is a not insignificant issue. But there's no doubt that what Dana has said is it's just true by definition. To have the spread of regional development of new intellectual capital built around new technologies, whether they are directly energy related or not, is something that is very much needed for regional diversification.
But because we have seen the tensions over TikTok and over, 5G Hawaii and so on. So to go back to, the trade wars, I suppose, are a way of sanctions, because we've had the phase 1 agreement with China, which includes, I think, energy exports from the US, but they're still below. I don't know how this will progress, but we also have Russia. We haven't mentioned Russia. Russia has been targeted for sanctions. I think the Biden campaign has said that they would like to impose sanctions on Russia for interference in the 2016 election. Is that something that, in one way, you've had the Trump administration have a relationship with Russia and Saudi Arabia, which allowed Donald Trump to intervene in securing this OPEC plus agreement back in April, when Russia and Saudi Arabia were at odds, and there was a price war and a battle for market share. So is it something that is of concern, that the relationship with Russia may worsen in if there's a change in administration? Dana, do you want to go there, or would somebody else prefer to raise your hands? I don't see any hand.
I can't speak to the specific approach by a possible Biden administration to sanctions. I will say, I
think we may have. Dana, oh, you're back. Sorry, we lost you for a moment.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
There is extensive, credible documentation and active litigation that Russia intervened in the US elections in 2016 and is doing it again today. And there is a widely accepted view, both among Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and across much of the Trump administration, I believe, is the Biden campaign, that Russia has interfered in conflicts across the Middle East that have aggravated them, led to loss of life, protected autocrats, authoritarians, human rights abusers, and criminals guilty of mass casualty events. Might a Biden administration attempt to engage in political processes that could end conflicts? I'm sure there will be an interest in seeing how, for example, the Syria conflict could be ended, and for that you would have to talk to officials in Moscow. But looking at what's happening in Belarus, what's happening across Europe, all the areas in which Russia is actively intervening, I believe the view is that this is an adversary and not a government with which there are many areas to cooperate.
Thanks. Now, Dana, and I wanted to bring in here the sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Is this something that is is this something that both sides agree is not a good thing to allow Nord Stream to sort of bring more gas from Russia to Europe to go ahead? Is it related? Is it just a political foreign policy issue, or is it also the US wanting to export more LNG to Europe? This may be simplistic, but Amos, you may want to come in here. You said you did.
I'll answer that. Yeah, no, I'll answer that more broadly. Look,
okay.
Joe Biden as vice president, when there were disagreements inside the Obama administration, was the leader in the administration that recognized very early the threat that Putin posed to US interest in Europe, to the security and safety and democracy in Europe, and ultimately spread beyond that into Syria. And in the early days of that recognition, there were many, even in the Obama administration, who saw that as maybe something of the past, that this is not, we're in the post-Cold War, we're in a different world. but he recognizes that he was the first to recognize that and acted on it. And if you look at his travels as vice president throughout Eastern Europe, that is what he was threatening about. The issue of energy was that Russia was using energy as a tool, not as an end. The ability to sell to Hungary was not the end. That was just the means of exerting pressure on Eastern European countries who had some countries had near 100% dependency on only one source and only one set of infrastructure, and had no ability to diversify. So came to this conversation came the issue of Nord Stream 2 originally, and if you recall, we talked about it as more Turk Stream plus Nord Stream 2. And that wasn't about whether or not Russia should be allowed to sell gas into Europe. Of course, it should be allowed to sell gas into Europe. It's an extremely important part of the gas market in Europe. The question was, are you going to be building pipelines and infrastructure that are political in nature and not commercial? And Nord Stream 2, we saw it at the time, and I still do, as a non-commercial deal, but rather one that has far more political implications for Russia than it does commercial ones. It is to be able to avoid the Ukrainian transit system and be able to go, if they had completed what they wanted, was Nord Stream 2 plus Turk Stream, and be able to supply all of Eastern Europe and make it almost impossible for them to diversify, and then use those debts and those price arrangements to exert pressure on those governments. But fast forward to where we are now, infrastructure has actually changed quite a bit. Supply has changed quite a bit in Europe. We're not in the same place. We still talk about Nord Stream 2 like it's 2014 or 2015. It is not. I still don't think it's a good idea for Europe. But we have LNG in Poland. We have infrastructure that's been built, and regulations that have been put in place in Europe that change the dynamic and have made Europe a far more diversified energy system. So that depends, and if you look at US LNG, and not just US, but just general LNG increases into Europe, they're quite significant over the last couple of years. So I think the sanctions on Russia will continue, not because we're trying to control, not because of energy. Energy is incidental to that. They are because Russia is a bad actor. And the most threatening trend that I see is that it's no longer just Orban in Hungary and some other countries, but rather we saw it is now the new leadership in Slovenia. We're seeing, as Dana mentioned before, Belarus, and we need to stand up far more forcefully to make sure that Putin is not able to achieve his main interest, which is a divided Europe and then a divided US Europe are his advantages. And that's what needs to change. So the first thing is to strengthen the alliances that we have in Europe. And the second step will be to use that strengthened transatlantic alliance to strengthen the pro-democracy forces again in Eastern and Central Europe. But as has been mentioned before, Putin's efforts are not just harmful to the US interests in Europe. He expanded them into Syria, and allowing that to happen was a mistake. And we should have been tougher and stronger to begin with back in the Obama administration about the role that Russia was allowed to play in Syria. But today we're fast forward again, 4 years have passed, and it's different, and they are entrenched, and they will have to be part of whatever we do in Syria. So I think that the energy piece of this for the Russians was always a means to an end, but it is the same for us. We are using energy and financial instruments as a mechanism for sanctions on Russia, but not because of inherent energy policy, but rather because of the national security goals that we are trying to achieve between the United States and Russia.
Yeah, I find it fascinating that the European Green Deal is really about moving towards, carbon neutrality, net zero, and gas is supposedly going to play a much smaller role in the energy mix in Europe, and a lot of other countries moving in that direction. So I find it a bit difficult to understand the tensions over gas in East Med, again with Europe in their sights, the producers. But I'm going to stop here and go to come November 4. We can expect that the US will pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, we've talked about the transition, we've talked about that. So there's been a lot of talk recently against Biden saying, talking about fracking and banning fracking, and a bit of confusion as to what he really meant by banning fracking, federal, non-federal land. But surely and the potential loss of jobs, I think the industry's up in arms, but surely there is job creation in the clean energy field, in the green energy field as well. And the US is not sort of a laggard when it comes to clean technology. And I think there's been a lot of studies talking about the potential for job creation, new jobs in a sort of clean, green energy sphere. So where do we see the US standing with regard to the rest of the world on the Paris Climate Agreement? Ed, do you want to?
I do, but I want to complete the conversation we've just had a little bit and make some observations on it. And it does move into the green set of issues. Amos had talked about a mistake of the Obama administration in allowing Russia to play an outsized role in the Middle East that it might not otherwise have played. And I think just putting in perspective, we have to remember that Russia is, a superpower when it comes to energy. It's the largest exporter of natural gas in the world by far. It is growing as an exporter of oil and gas. But it's got an economy that's somewhere between that of the state of Florida and the state of New York. And part of the policy that needs to be orchestrated in dealing with Russia is recognizing where it is from an economic perspective, recognizing where its vulnerabilities are, recognizing what its demographic and high-tech vulnerabilities are, where its investments are in cybersecurity and the like, and dealing with it that way. And yes, Kate, going to your comments on Europe, there is a dramatic difference of view in the minds of different people on the future role of natural gas. I was recently at a similar Zoom call with somebody senior from the IEA and somebody senior from the analytical community. And if you look at the IEA's new WEO report, the World Energy Outlook, natural gas plays a shrinking role in the energy system of the world going forward. And by going forward, I mean from now going forward to 2025 and 2025, obviously to 2035. Whereas from a purely economic perspective, there's really no reason to take that position. You may take it for parts of Europe, but natural gas is much more likely in the minds of a bunch of us to have a significant role to play, both on a green side and on a cost side. So that's also part of what we're moving into. Now, I think undoubtedly that there will be one of the major differences between a potential Biden presidency and a Trump administration would be the re-embracement of the international needs, the global requirements to negotiate on climate change, and a recognition that the Paris Agreement was very much a function of US-Chinese agreement and diplomacy. Now, China may not have been interested in climate change per se so much as it was interested in a cleaner environment for domestic political reasons, but that doesn't matter what the motivations were or what the motivations are for the new China green policy. There are people who undoubtedly will go into a potential Biden administration who are very close to China on a variety of energy and environmental issues. And I see the potential for not a complete reversion to where US-China relations were. We'll never go back to that because of what's happened on cybersecurity and technology theft. But certainly there will be a recognition of a commonality of interests that currently does not exist, and that will be able both to cement better, more balanced relations between the US and China on the one hand, and potentially accelerate a movement toward meeting the 1.5 degree goals or the 2 degree goals.
Again, I'm going to, I think we've got a bit of time now open for questions, unless somebody wants to come in with and expand on what's been said. I mean, the climate agreement, the Paris climate deal, really sets the US on a different path, doesn't it? If it drops, well, it will be November 4. That will be the US withdrawing from the Paris agreement. Is that a sort of reflection of the more inward-looking policies, which have really been, I think, more solidified by COVID-19? You know, people are inward-looking. There's a race to develop a vaccine and make sure that you get it. The increasing the transatlantic tensions, the trade, trade wars, sanctions. Are we seeing sort of the fraying of sort of global trade and sort of the diplomacy being now superseded by more internal concerns over how to get away from, how to survive this crisis? And Ed, you mentioned the World Energy Outlook by the IEA, and they do say that coal, for example, will never recover to pre-COVID levels. Gas is the only fossil fuel that will see some growth. And if we go back to the original Trump campaign, he was very big on coal. I mean, I don't see that will continue. The sort of championing of coal on cost, it doesn't make sense. I think the Biden campaign wants to export. No, I'm sorry, it's Dan Brouillette who was saying that the US would like to export coal technology cleanly. So where do we stand? Do we stand apart? Does the US stand apart on the climate change agenda? And I know we don't want to spend too much time, but where do we see that going?
Kate, I think that first, the promise that Donald Trump made 4 years ago that he was going to grow coal back to the 1970s was I don't think anybody really took it. Nobody should have taken it seriously. The Obama administration started, and coal was over 50% of the U.S. Power generation. It ended less than 28%, and we're now at about 11%, I think, somewhere in the 10 to 12% coal. So that just shows you how dramatic the decline has been from 50 to 30 down to closer to 10. So really, it's been declining by 2/3 under the Trump administration. But I think there's going to be stark differences between a Trump second term or even the first term and a Biden presidency across the board. On almost every issue, there's going to be stark differences. But climate is surely going to be one of the most stark differences from a president who wanted to exit the Paris Accords to one that wants to have an expanded one. And that's why I keep coming back to this. We keep focusing in the political campaign on, does Joe Biden want to ban fracking? No, he has said multiple times he does not want to. He will not ban fracking. That is to mean that the current market will continue as is. We're not going to lose more jobs during COVID before we have the other jobs to replace them. But that should not be confused with a significant effort. And I think the next stimulus that will be in the trillions will have significant funding behind this energy transition. And so will he end it by edict in this first year, fracking? Maybe not, but I think that fracking is going to get reduced significantly because of the market conditions. If he is successful in this energy transition goals that he wants to pursue, then this will be a natural transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. But transition doesn't mean that it shuts down overnight. It means that we decline them as into the future for domestic use and eventually around the world as we increase the use of other forms of energy. And this is going to be a significant difference between these two administrations on bringing the globe together. And that's a concern that I have, is how do you bring parts of the world that are not able to spend resources that have been depleted, state and federal national resources that have been depleted during COVID, that will be needed to invest in new infrastructure. But I think this is going to be the policy of the Biden administration, to pursue a global effort as well as a domestic effort, not to get rid of fossil fuels, as he has put it, as Biden has put it, but rather to incentivize and accelerate the growth of technology and renewable energy in the near and medium future, so that we have an entirely different future in the long term.
Yeah, I think there seems to be a bit of confusion as to what, zero carbon. It's not it's not hydrocarbons, it's carbon emissions that we're fighting.
And it's net zero. It's net zero.
It's net zero. So yeah, you have to balance it out.
It's an important distinction.
Yeah, because you can decarbonize with CCUS and other technologies. Now we have a question from Mani Payan, who says, has Biden signaled any support for NOPEC legislation? Who are the likely choices to lead policy in a Biden administration? I don't think we can answer that, but maybe the first part of it we can answer is, has he signaled any support for NOPEC legislation, which we haven't really heard talked about, for a while, but great for your thoughts. The NOPEC legislation, which would allow, I think, the US to sue members of OPEC for cartel-like behavior. A bit difficult since, the US has actually been actively involved in trying to get production increased and decreased by OPEC. But Ed, you've been to these, you've been involved. You have attended these meetings, and I've seen you there. Do you think has there been any indication from the Biden camp that they supported?
Well, I think we're a long way from having NOPEC legislation arise as a politically significant event. I can imagine. I think we can all imagine conditions in which we might see higher oil prices, probably not sustainably, but we had high oil prices in the last decade, partly because of a lack of investment, but largely because of the failure of 4 OPEC countries. We had, if you go back to the last drop in oil demand, which was 1998-99, it was an Asian recession, setting aside the great financial crisis. 4 OPEC countries, Nigeria, Venezuela, or Iran, and Iraq, as we might remember going back to that period, had plans to add collectively 1 million barrels a day of oil to the market every year for the next 10 years. And 5 years later, those 4 countries were producing less than they were producing in 1998. And still in 2008, they were producing less. So the failure of the petrostate was what was responsible largely for $147 Brent, not coupled maybe with financial flows and changes in the financialization of commodities. So I can imagine, structural internal failure in both Iran and Iraq, leading to significantly lower production, and add to that Nigeria, where things are not exactly stable, and where we have governments in petrostates that have no borrowing capacity at home or abroad, can't pay for the civil service, can't pay for healthcare, can't pay for education, and a lot of domestic unhappiness. So I can imagine, even in this new energy period, having a significant supply disruption and getting back to not $100 oil, but $70 oil. Maybe that could get you back to an environment in which NOPEC legislation might be considered as semi-viable. But I don't think it's an issue for consideration anytime in the near term. I would like to mention one other thing, and it goes back to a little bit about what Amos was saying and what you were saying, Kate. If you look at the 5 years before 2020, so including 2019, and you look at job creation in the United States, job creation in the energy sector was actually the second largest level of job creation by sector in the United States. And it was a period of time in which the shale revolution through technology was seeing a lower, decreasing amount of people involved in the exploitation of hydrocarbons. Those new energy jobs were all new energy jobs. So we had already seen the growth potential in the first years of the Trump administration of new energy and its role in employment. So, putting it in the center of a very large stimulus package would not be doing something that was silly or uneconomic. It would be very much going along with the trend that had been unfolding, and where, as Amos had said, we now have a crisis in state and local government funding that was the source of much of the new energy jobs that could come out of a new stimulus package.
Did you?
I think the irony is that President Obama presided over the largest increase in the energy industry, and President Trump has presided over the biggest shrinking of the workforce in the energy industry. You would know that from the campaign and how we talk about things in America, but it's just a irony.
Yeah, I think we saw that was.
But I just want to add something to what Ed said. You could also see the flip side, where a JCPOA could add 1 million barrels from Iran over, let's say, an 18-month period. A successful diplomacy in Central and South America could lead to another 1 million plus barrels out of Venezuela. So the geopolitical volatility in oil markets has not gone away. I think I would endorse completely what Ed said about Nigeria. I think if oil prices continue in this price range, which I believe they will, Iraq is going to continue to suffer and not be able to pay salaries. We're already seeing an increase in ISIS attacks in Iraq, and that will get worse the more the central government is not able to pay salaries. If a JCPOA is achieved, obviously that will put some pressure on oil prices. So we have some volatility that is still yet to come, even though we're going through this energy transition.
Thanks. Yes, in fact, we're seeing in Iraq. I think yesterday there were new demonstrations against the government because they are fiscally very tight, and there are certain countries that can't really afford to have prices at these levels: Nigeria, Angola, Iran, Iraq. And the sanctions, of course, Iraq has a waiver because of their damaged infrastructure. They rely on Iran for imports of gas and electricity, and they do get the occasional the waivers from the US because it is actually politically risky to allow Iraq not to have access to Iranian gas and electricity. I think there's an attempt to bring Iraq into the GCC fold, the electricity grid, but that's going to take time. So they are vulnerable. Dana, did you want to come in? We don't seem to have. Oh, we have one more question from an anonymous attendee who wants us to discuss the risks to domestic infrastructure under Biden win, looking specifically at the NG space, pipelines, MVP, PHP pipelines, and future projects that will be necessary for egress out of dry gas basins. Do we want to respond to an anonymous attendee? But anyway, domestic infrastructure, I know there's issues on pipeline permitting and other issues that I'm not really that well. I'm sort of familiar with them, but we don't really want to go into the nitty-gritty of every single pipeline and what the issues are in getting them done. But I suppose infrastructure is really important. Does Ed or Amos or Dana, who wants to answer?
I think Amos is going to have to leave us early.
Yeah. So do you want to have famous last words? A few final.
Thanks, Ed. Look, I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty, as you said, on infrastructure, but I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I do think there's a risk, an infrastructure risk, if Biden gets elected. And I mean, from an industry perspective, risk. I don't want to sound, not from, it's not a negative. It will be, I can guarantee it will be more difficult to get pipelines approved and infrastructure approved, and anything that requires federal government permitting, licensing, and approvals will be more difficult. It will take longer. The NEPA, or the environmental requirements, will be more stringent. And that to me is something that the industry should take as fact. That will increase costs and may delay projects further. It will also complicate, as we as a country have seen changes in the flows of energy, of where they're produced and where they need to go, and it will make it more difficult to address those bottlenecks that exist today, because our centers of production have changed over time. and therefore we need to move things from there, both to the domestic demand as well as to the export centers. And I think that it's going to be very difficult to grow. I don't believe that we are going to see additional LNG projects approved anytime soon under a Biden administration. I'm not sure that we need any more, or that the world needs any more. But I do think there's going to be constraint when it comes to new infrastructure in the oil and gas business.
I mean, talking about the current situation, that there are those who say that the pipelines do need to be, upgraded and retrofitted because of the environmental risks. But I remember, covering the energy markets in the old days. If there was a hurricane, prices would be in the Gulf of Mexico. Prices would shoot up. But the market's been very, very sort of relaxed about the fact that it is oversupplied, that we have brimming storage, that we do have, and I suppose we do have enough spare capacity, particularly in Saudi Arabia, having cut back so much. So is that still something that is important? Saudi Arabia, I remember the late Christophe de Margerie, who was the CEO of Total, said once at a conference, he said, if I lose Saudi Arabia, might as well switch off the lights and go home, because there is no other producer that can actually replace Saudi Arabia in terms of not just its production capacity, its low cost, but also its spare capacity. Dana, is that sort of an accurate description? Is that one of the reasons why the market is so sort of relaxed about the fact that there are disruptions from Venezuela, and Iran is off the market, and Libya is slowly coming back, and the hurricane season has been quite prolific this year? So is that one of the strengths that Saudi Arabia has as a sort of, the leading exporter still of oil?
It's sort of, it's a more complicated issue, I think, than you posed it as, Kate. I think the major factor that's in the market that has subdued prices is a combination of two things. One is the level of inventory, which is sort of overwhelming. We don't have an exact number, but the world seems to have built between the low point of the year and the peak of the year, 1,100,000,000 barrels of inventory of crude oil and petroleum products. Now that's just a colossal amount of oil, not distributed evenly across the planet, but a lot of it was on the US Gulf Coast. A lot of it was on the US West Coast. So that was one mitigating factor, along with how limited the damage was to US infrastructure, even with a record hurricane season. So I think the inventories played a big role. I think sentiment about the economic recovery, which is related to sentiment about and fears of what's unfolding right now with the current wave of COVID infections, particularly in Europe and the US, putting a less glossy picture on global GDP growth. I think that is a critical factor. Saudi spare capacity is there, but it's a function of policy. And yes, the Saudis have tended to make a lot of money by using the spare capacity in periods of high prices, which may be justification in and of itself for that. And undoubtedly, it is part of the inventory potential of the world. But I think it's more the tangible inventory available that has put the damper on prices, and the relatively relaxed nature of the financial community about concerns over a spike in oil or gas prices anytime soon.
Thanks. David, do you want to come in here? Because that's, no, okay. There is another question, but I'm not really sure that we can go into it. It says, do you think Biden will support US oil company growth in Mexico? I mean, I know that Mexico was one of the holdouts when OPEC was trying to get an agreement with non-OPEC, and they sort of reluctantly came in, and but their production has been in decline. There's been changes in leadership and policy. I don't think it's really up to the United States to determine whether they go into Mexico or not. Ed, is that accurate, or I think that's more of
no? I think it's fair to say that Mexico is confronting a problem. Fortunately for Mexico, oil and gas is a significantly lower percentage of GDP than it was. It's under 10%. Unfortunately for them, it's a very high percentage of government revenue, which is a dilemma. But Mexico has lost out in not being able to attract capital at a time when capital is not there to put into the hydrocarbon sector. And as Amos said, a diplomacy and a new potential Biden administration toward other parts of South America and the Middle East may be more encouraging of investment conditions in other countries in the Western Hemisphere than in Mexico. So it will be undoubtedly a problem for the next Mexican administration.
I think we have another question. If not, okay. Another anonymous. To what extent is an Iranian oil return priced in for the next year, given the way Congress works and the balancing needed with other Gulf countries? Is that too optimistic? Who wants to go for this one? Is the return of uranium, potential return of uranium?
Nothing is priced in. If you look at the composition of financial market participants, it is the liquidity in the market is low. The relationship between managed money longs and shorts is extremely low. It's higher than the lowest point, but it's not anywhere close what is normal in a normal market. So I'd say there's nothing about this market that is priced in. If you look at where the spreads are between West African crudes and Brent, or Urals and Brent, that would suggest the market is tighter than where current pricing is.
I'll just add there, part of the question was about based on the way Congress works and balancing with other Gulf countries. So almost all of the sanctions imposed on Iran for a variety of issues during the Trump administration have been the result of executive action. So by the Trump administration, not congressional action. In the nuclear space, there has not been one sanction during the Trump administration passed by Congress. There have been sanctions on Iran passed for other purposes. If a Biden administration wanted to take actions to provide some sanctions relief for Iran to access its offshore reserves, to be able to sell some of its oil, that could be done without going to Congress or without affirmative congressional action. What I'm saying does not mean that one should expect the Biden administration to not consult with Congress. We saw the results of actions taken by the White House, by an administration without congressional buy-in as it relates to Iran, both during the Obama administration and during the Trump administration. So it is possible that there would be congressional consultations. It is possible, based on what a Biden policy toward Iran might be, that there could be room for congressional action. I don't know the answers to these questions, but just to say, regardless of what market expectation is, if a Biden administration wanted to come back into compliance with the Iran nuclear agreement, which means it would have to provide relief to some of the sanctions that have been imposed and reimposed by the Trump administration, it can do that absent affirmative congressional action.
Thank you, Dana. I think we don't have any more questions. I'm going to now say thank you very much. Amos has already left us because he had another commitment. I want to thank you, Dana and Ed, for taking part in this. And I think Rebecca is going to be finishing this up in the last few minutes.
Oh, thanks, Kate. Actually, it's me, David.
Oh, sorry, you're back. Okay.
That's
Sorry,
okay.
David.
That's
I was
all
told
right.
you were
Wow.
busy.
Wow, really want to thank you, Kate, Ed, Amos, Dana. What an outstanding webinar. Really, in a week's time, we're going to know what's up, and I think we're probably all anxious to have that process come to a close. Anyway, without a doubt, our energy industries will be a different day, and we thank you very much for your expertise, for your time today. I encourage all of you to be aware that this webinar has been recorded, will be available on our Rewind. I wish you all a good rest of the day, wherever this finds you on our fine globe. Thank you for listening. Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.